Councillor Mary, Group Manager for Planning. We have Karen Yates, our policy person, and tells me what I can and can't do all the time, poor Karen. And of course, Harry Wilson, our CEO. And also,
also tells them what he can and cannot do.
Yeah, tries to yeah. So we've also got councillors Rebecca Fox, Lee Hay, Pam Colenso, and Pip Maynard, and we've got Alistair Plummer on Zoom from his, I think he's fishing up in Taupo at the moment. So just a quick bit of housekeeping. We've got a pretty big crowd here. There are some chairs still here, and just for a bit of overflow. The housekeeping rules, there's the exit that you came in. I do hope that you've signed in. If you haven't on your way out, could you please do sign in. We've also got an exit here, and in the event of something going wrong, please assemble on the playground until the all clear is given. So just to give you an overview of what some of you were here last week for the long-term plan discussions, and it's very similar to that. It's to inform you of the spatial plan and answer questions to allow you to make a submission. We're not doing submissions here, we're not taking notes here. It's really just to answer those questions and assist you to make a correct submission. We're not going to enter into a debate on the relative merits of particular answers that we've done. That will be done through the submission process. But if I could emphasise to you that the staff and the councillors have spent a long time in looking at all the information and to come up with this spatial plan. There were meetings ad nauseum. At one stage, I actually shut down the process, and all the councillors got into cars and we drove around and re-examined on the ground some of the expansion zones that we were looking at. So it is not just something that we're throwing out there saying that will do. It is also a totally new spatial plan. Many of you may have submitted on the previous spatial plan from the previous council. It is quite different. And so if you submitted on the previous one, you need to pull those out, re-examine them in light of the new spatial plan and resubmit, because we're not looking at the submissions from the previous spatial plan process. When we have created this, there's been a huge amount of consultation, pre-consultation already done, so that we are presenting to you something that we think should be fit for purpose. We had quite a lot of public consultation with the long-term plan, and we added spatial plan into that. And all those focus groups have all been taken into account to what we're proposing. We are now consulting with you on. Also, do remember that the spatial plan is not a statutory document. It is a guide to what is happening. When it comes to actual zonings and changing the zonings, that is the district plan. But the spatial plan certainly guides the district plan. So also, just to give you when Russell starts to go and restart to go through the whole process, there's one that's area that's cropped up a bit, both in the long-term plan and the spatial plan, and that is growth projections. So this sits underneath, or was done concurrently with the Wellington Regional Growth Framework, which is where the government had insisted that all the councils of the Wellington region, including Korowhenua, get together and look at how they will accommodate up to 200,000 new people over until 2035. And it is the opinion of all the mayors that we were being put under the gun to say, show us how you're going to do it, or we may start to look at whether you're doing enough. Is that subtle enough? Harry, you told me off last night. So what we're now doing is saying, what is part of that regional growth framework? It was actually relatively easy. I think over the last year, we've had a 6% growth in ratepayers. Our projected median growth that we picked is a 1.2% growth. So we are exceeding that already, but we don't know what will happen in 3 years, 4 years, and 5 years. So this also then reads our LTP investment infrastructure plan. So we have taken a medium growth figure to look at the spatial plan and how that accommodates the requirements or demand of the growth within the South Martinborough. This is just residential at the moment. It's a really big job. Next year we will begin on the next part of the spatial plan, which is industrial, commercial, and where we want to protect rural land. So there's another layer to be done on this one. If you can think about that, this is just residential at the moment, and we'll go through this whole process again on that commercial, industrial, rural next year. So with that, I'm going to pass over to Russell to do the. No, actually, I've got my first slides. Did I have my first slide? So what we're doing is we're acknowledging that the South Wairarapa is a desirable place to live, and there is quite a lot of demand at the moment for and how do we accommodate that sensibly? What we also do is we're assuming that all three towns grow equally. At the moment, within the regional growth framework, the emphasis is along transport nodes, and you're going to see that through the Wellington, Petone, and Upper Hutt and Waterloo, with the density occurring around traffic nodes. We are still looking at all three towns having some growth. But at the same time, we're trying to keep the special, unique character of each of the towns. And that for the whole council has been one of the key points of this spatial plan growth strategy. We do need to protect the rural areas and also look at the dark sky initiative, which has huge potential for the region. And we spend a lot of time and money to actually get to the point that we're at now. And also the projected growth rates do vary for each town. So we will go through all three towns, but for this meeting in particular, we will spend a bit more time on Martinborough as such and then touch on the other towns. So with that, now I'll pass over to Russell O'Leary. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Yes, thank you for coming along and being invested in the future of your town. I think the first slide here is population. Clear point I'd like to make in terms of just general awareness is population projections are at best predictions or informed estimates of the way forward. We can see that Martinborough stretches from 2019 jumping across to 2051 with a population change of 647. As we've done our population evaluation and land use planning component, spatial plan work, we have looked at a range of projections. We've looked in-house at what the trend is in terms of building and new homes emerging across the district. So we've tried to provide some balance there, and that's where our thinking has been across those two aspects. We've just like throughout the region, Alex mentioned the Wellington Regional Growth Framework. The factor plugged in there is that we're using medium level predictions, not low, not high. We're taking a steady course and using medium level predictions across the span of 30 years. And we are prepared to review the figures as we work forward. So we've been mindful of doing it carefully. So the other thing to point out to you in terms of us doing the work, we're trying to use the predictions wisely both for our LTP work and our spatial plan for results across the district, and there's value to be had in that. So that's all I'll say about population. We come now to the slide on the spatial plan itself. So the spatial plan is your high level thinking in terms of the key components of the district strategically that we value and we want to protect, as well as doing our growth work. Some of the key ingredients on our spatial plan map include such things as recognising coastal impacts and coastal erosion and coming up with considerations around managed retreat for coastal settlements. We know that local marae rightly have want to see the best for their communities and prospect of Papakayunga housing for some of the marae, or most of the marae, including the new one in Featherston, Putumokai. We also have within recognition of components for the district is the Dark Sky Reserve, a natural fit for our environment, and we've done work there in terms of changing the outdoor lighting rules to support the Dark Sky Initiative. We're also recognising that transportation into the district and connection in and around the district and out of the district is key, so we try to factor that in. And we've also recognised that from views that have come up that the lake restoration work needs to occur in terms of betterment for the lake, along with biodiversity, consideration of biodiversity. That's quite a modern topic, but doing your conservation work and prospects of biodiversity into the future. So there's some of the key ingredients in the spatial plan, which is essentially a high-level district strategic plan going forward, usually based across 20 or 30 years. We've also taken up the challenge to focus on basing our work in terms of step one around residential growth options, and as I said, using stats, looking at the land, looking at the constraints, and so the point we're at now is residential growth options as well as doing our strategic plan shaping. Thanks, Karen. So the residential growth options, what's been at the heart of our work? What have we had to take into account? The Mayor mentioned that we've had community engagement. We think we've been active in that space, both with key stakeholders and getting out of the office, liaising with stakeholders. We've added our robustness into the system in terms of using a multi-constraint analysis or assessment approach across 11 constraints, includes such things as what's going to give us quality capacity, what are the nature of the soil types in certain areas, infrastructure, both water and wastewater, and community, what we know of community views at this point. So some of an example of the constraints there. We need to, within that work, we've had a mix of staff having their professional component. We've had staff from Wellington Water as well, and we've had the benefit of Ree facilitating that and posing our thinking as we go through. And we've also been prepared to refine the data, step back, and then re-look at the information again. So there's been a bit of rigour in that sense. And we've also got ourselves out of the office, staff and councillors, taking mini tours around the towns to look at what the potentials are in certain sites around the town and having informed discussions as we undertook those site visits. So that's basically it. I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce Ree Anderson. Ree is probably one of the leading consultants doing spatial plan work around the country, Rotorua, Palmerston North, to name a few, and she's good at her job, so we have the benefit of her wisdom and facilitated guidance. So Ree's going to take us on a guided tour through the towns and the options that we've come up with.
Thanks, Russell, and that is a very generous introduction, and now I have to live up to the reputation. So, good Kota, thanks very much for the opportunity to be here. Can you all hear me down the back? Fantastic. If I go quiet, just put your hand up and you please let me know. So, if we just move on, just before we go to the preferred option for Martinborough, I thought it's really important to go back and talk about the fact that we defined more than one option to look at in terms of growth for Martinborough. So this is a new process, as the Mayor indicated. We ended up with 6 options that we assessed. How did we come to define what those 6 options were? Well, we looked at a range of factors. First, we looked at the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, and that is about supply meeting demand. In other words, that there is enough land supply or redevelopment capacity within existing areas to meet demand. That's critically important because if supply doesn't meet demand, then housing affordability becomes an issue. And one of the things we heard from you in your feedback was housing affordability is critical. And we've heard that from businesses and residents, businesses in terms of key workers, not being able to get workers accommodation for those who are working in the hospitality and viticulture industry, for example, as well as concern for young people who are starting out and needing places to rent. So that was very important. The regional policy statement was important because that generally has a direction to have urban containment rather than urban sprawl. Now, as that happens, that is very consistent with the community voice of South Wairarapa. We have heard that you do not want sporadic subdivision through your rural areas, that you do want to protect rural production land, and that you do want a sense of containment, while at the same time making sure there is a distinct town and country boundary without compromising the character of the towns. And I'm going to come back to that because that has been a common theme for every town, that while growth can occur, it needs to occur in a way that respects the character and heritage, and that can be done. There are new tools around to assist that, and I'm going to take you through some of those tools. And as Russell said also, we also looked at evidence. So he mentioned, for example, we looked at issues such as soils. Well, for Martinborough, for example, all the soils around the Martinborough township and just beyond are class 3, which means they are moderately versatile. They are not highly versatile, class 1 and 2. Definitely it is the class 1 and 2 soils that we would be trying to avoid in terms of where urbanisation goes. So those sorts of factors, or liquefaction or flooding, or any of those factors, we've also taken into account. So that is how we drew down into having 6 options and then to come into a preferred option. Just in terms of what the preferred option is, that we're putting forward for feedback, is for Martinborough to have further intensification around 250 metres within the boundary of the Martinborough Square. That is considered a walkable distance. But what is a walkable distance is also sometimes determined as a 500, 800 or 1,000 square metres. It depends on many factors. Those factors can be things like whether you're walking to a train station, what the weather's like, whether it's flat topography or not, whether you're going to the shops. We have taken the idea of a 250 metre boundary at this point in time on the basis that it is very walkable, but also what degree of change do you want in Martinborough in terms of trying to also maintain a character. Okay, because in the inner area we are suggesting densities in the order of, as a guideline, 1 house for every 150 square metres or up to 200 square metres. So again, we're asking for your feedback on that sort of density guideline. We are saying that combined with urban design guides, it's not just open slab. As well as that, we are looking at the existing area that is from the square right to the existing zoning boundary, and more or less keeping the same level of density that you have now, which is a minimum of 400 square metres per house lot, or an average of 5, but again, adding in a design guide criteria to make sure those character components that you all value within Martinborough are retained. And then beyond that, and this is different to what's been proposed in the past in the southeast area, of what we are calling the Oxford Street outer residential lifestyle, is lifestyle lots, somewhere in the order of 2,000 to 4,000 square metres. So again, we are asking for your feedback on that. And I'm going to go through that in a little bit more detail shortly. But just before that, if we are looking at the greenfield areas, we are also looking at the process or a concept called master planning. So thank you, Karen. I wanted to just talk about what is master planning. So master planning it's a non-statutory document again, but it is a detailed land use and integrated infrastructure plan. It is a plan that is done in collaboration with key landowners, particularly the large landowners, but also the wider community that are affected or are interested, and iwi, regional and central government and infrastructure providers. So for example, if there is a state highway involved, then NZTA are a critical infrastructure provider that would be included in the process. Now I wanted to give you a local example, and I was involved in this example very early on with Martinborough District Council to set up the collaborative process. They had a very which is to the east of Levin. So Levin, Martinborough is like its CBD. This area was originally zoned just a very large lot residential development, but not unlike South Wairarapa, Levin is growing quickly because of the OTNL, the Otaki to Levin highway, and people from Wellington are now choosing Levin as a more affordable housing option. So the council wanted to look at rezoning this area of Greenfields land, which is converting effectively rural and lifestyle land to urban, and having some higher density zoning on it. And the idea was that they work collaboratively and undertake a master plan. This is the master plan that they've gone out for consultation on, and they've now issued a plan change, and the submissions have closed on that plan change. So that process is just about complete. But the reason I put it up here, and I know it's hard for you to read it from the background, is it shows how detailed it is. In this case, because it is going to be serving a community of around 2,500 people, there will be a small commercial centre, to serve local needs, but not a centre big enough to be competitive to Levin itself. It does have some restrictions as well in terms of large commercial floor plates, so they've become quite regulatory around that because they're trying to keep a village-like concept in terms of their new vision. It does have the opportunity as an educational precinct and to have its own primary school. It has key reserves building on some that are already there. But the other thing, and I think this is really important, apart from the subdivision pattern in terms of connecting streets and networks, are two things. There is already a level of existing residential development here in terms of large lots. And so the master plan has to take account of what is there as well. It's done that to a degree because not unlike what is being proposed for Martinborough, it's looking at the more intensive areas where the little villages, it's then saying some more medium density out here and then some large long areas, taking account of what is already there. It acknowledges that it's going to plan that some of the change is going to be implemental, and also it's acknowledged that it has to be tied in with infrastructure. So there was a potential for the motorway which runs down here to cut the whole town off, and there's been a tremendous effort to make sure it connects in. The level of detail and how much you want to have control over design, if you like, is actually up to the council and the community because it is a balancing process. So there are some areas in here where they wanted to, enhance streetscapes, and they've also wanted to enhance pedestrianisation and cycling. So there are some precinct rules in that plan whereby you cannot actually have a driveway where there is a cycleway along the street, you have a rear access lane. These are all new tools that are starting to be used across New Zealand to get the better outcomes that communities are wanting. And the other element here too is, the streetscape design. I've looked at the streets quite a lot around Martinborough because I believe that they actually represent quite a unique part of the character of this place. I call them quiet streets. And I don't call them quiet streets just because there might be less traffic than in a metropolitan area. They hardly have any road markings. You do not tell people where they have to park. I don't see, like I would in Auckland, white marks, yellow marks, cross marks, green marks of bus lanes. It is actually visually intrusive, the amount of painting on some of the roads in places in our metropolitan areas. We don't do it very well. So I can go along the streets here and I can see some areas where you've got paving on one side, grass on one. I've seen areas where you've got curb channeling, where you've still got the informality of rural, where you haven't got the curb channeling. And the one thing about streets and roads is, generally speaking, unless it's a private road, the council has control over what that street is like. And you as a community can actually talk about how that impacts on your character. And I actually dragged the councillors out one day, didn't we? We went out to actually look at how each of the streets around Martinborough are quite different, and that they really, really contribute to the character. And you can also indicate, whether you want tree planting on your verges and those other things. Those are things that really help. There's a lot of other subtle design qualities as well. I remember many years ago, there was a whole big controversy when infill development came in, where you had a 1/4 acre section and you had your first house up the front And the quarter-acre section used to have about 11 metre to 9 metre front boundary, and then they used to put a house at the back. And there was a whole lot of controversy around it. There is a Australian Victorian Urban Design Guideline, and it says, while that's not the best form of development, if you have to do it like that, do not allow the front yard to reduce more than 30%. Because what that does is it still gives you that idea of public interface, that space between the street, and also an opportunity for planting within private space, which also helps amenity. So there's a whole range of tools, and the reality is the devil's in the detail of how well it's executed and how well infrastructure is brought up. So I just wanted to mention that this council is committed to master planning for Martinborough and the growth areas and the greenfield areas. It has put a budget in the long-term plan for that, and similarly it has done the same for Featherston, and come briefly on to Featherston later. So that is what master planning is. Thank you, Karen. Look, I just wondered, I'm going to pass that slide over and go straight to the map, Karen, because I think we can. And I'll talk about that slide looking at the map, it's probably easier. So I've just described here that there were 6 options and they've been labelled A, B, C, D, E. Now, when we actually scored them, I didn't score them, I facilitated a process of relevant staff from across council, from planning, policy, infrastructure, consenting, infrastructure in terms of Wellington Water as well. And we did it in a way that tried to reduce cognitive bias. I won't bore you with the details on that, so that we came up with a scoring, not weighted, but we came up with a scoring. Now, as it happened, this inner area here, for intensification, and MD, which is more or less the existing zone of the urban design guide, they both scored well. But we also then had to look at, well, if we had these new densities here, which we're proposing, how many households might actually be able to be developed, how many people might want to actually redevelop and take that opportunity up, and how many people would actually be able to be located within that area of NE and ND. Well, it depends on what your assumptions are. We took a figure of, let's say that there are 25% uptake. Why do we take a 25% uptake? Because the Wellington Regional Framework's taking a 25% uptake in terms of nodes such as Featherston. But also, working with developers in the past on other plans, it's very clear when you have this opportunity here, not everyone wants to take it up. And so when we started to look at this, depending on what your assumptions are, then based on the medium projections that the Mayor and Russell referred to, maybe you'd get 50 or 60% possible growth within that area that could be accommodated. So what does that tell us? It tells us we have to go somewhere else as well. And so that's when we started to look at the other options. And as I said, these other options came in through a whole range of feedback from yourselves, as well as those other matters that I mentioned. These were then scored as well, and they all scored differently. Now, this area, I know there's a history here in terms of it being known, I think, as a southeast growth area. It's now called, in this plan here, the Oxford Outer Residential Lifestyle Area. My understanding in this with the southeast growth area, there was a consideration of the 400 to 500 square metre lot boundaries. The suggestion for the proposition here is and I'm borrowing the phrase that Karen talks about, is feathering. Feathering is intensive here, mid density here, and lower density here. So that's the proposition, and the proposition for this area to be master planned, so that you get a good outcome, is around 2,000 to 4,000 square metres. Now, we accept that there are some areas here that have got some existing development, and it may be through that master planning process that there is some differentiation in that 2,000 to 4,000 square metres as well. Okay, but that is the overall high-level proposition, and it's very accessible. One thing that's amazing in terms of the square and the pattern, it's a very walkable place, Martinborough, is there is a great line of sight right up to the square here. And you really can feel a sense of connection to the square and to central Martinborough. It's contiguous, and it keeps your proposition with the town-country boundary. So that goes down to Todd Street. We also looked at areas such as the Ferry Road area here, NF. There are some matters here around other matters we identified through the scoring process of fan, frost and noise, and also potential spray drift. There are some issues to do with the 100-year flooding here, so it's scored a little bit lower. We did look at the proposition because there are some good connections back up to the school here that could allow it. If you look at distance from the square, the Martinborough NA area here and NF, they're both about 1 to 1.2 kilometres at that boundary and that boundary. So they both have the same level of more or less of proximity. So in that sense, they are connected, but there were just a couple of other things in terms of more environmental flooding and the water and wastewater that made that score a little bit lower. And in this area here of Hawkins Drive, it's quite a different pattern of subdivision. So what we have seen around Martinborough, if you look at this is a grid pattern here, we're starting to see more of a cul-de-sac development through this large lot. And this scored a little bit lower, partly because of the existing pattern. It might be harder to change that, those sorts of things. It doesn't have quite the same sense of visual connection to the square that is allowed through Oxford Street. So a range of factors there as well as infrastructure. And then MC scored a little bit lower, I think, as well from recollection. I just have to go back to my notes on that one. MC was just a little bit lower. So MF and MB were pretty much on a par, 34 and 34 each, just in terms of the score. So what's in the documentation, the public consultation document for yourselves, is to say, we don't know exactly how many people might fit in here. Let's pretend there was an average of 2,000 square metre lots in there, then you might fit 200 homes. If the average was 3,000, you won't. Those sorts of things. And until the master planning is done, we don't know. So there is a proposition in terms of keeping development close to the boundary, the town and country boundary of other areas, and we're asking for your perspectives and views on what you think about that. If growth took off, for example, and there was a need for more supply, where would you want it, MF, MC, MB, if the proposition that's there went forward as it is now? So that really is it on the table. Have I left anything out that I should be covering from any of the team?
That's great.
And so I think we're over to questions, Karen.
Right, so if I'll just remind you of some information, not a debate, but does anyone have any questions about what you've heard? But I'd also like to just reinforce as well that online, there is a huge amount of documentation on how we arrived at these decisions, how those scores were achieved, which of the relative scores, and what the assumptions were made. So what you're seeing is a very high level, and the plan is a lot of information is still there. So yeah, any questions? Yeah, thanks.
On your first slide, you talked about character. Is there not a definitive list, but a guide to what you're talking about and the character that you're trying to maintain? So if when we go to put our submission in, if we have some key points that you're talking about, what you're trying to maintain in this town, we can say, well, actually, in some of these areas, if we want to achieve this, we should look at doing that. But at the moment, we're quite blind as to say, well, we think we should have this many square metres or walking from this distance, because we actually have no idea what you use to determine what is the characteristic you want to retain.
It's not really what I want to retain, it's actually what you want to retain. And one of the things about master planning is the identification of what the essence of character is. So for example, I was involved way back in 2006 in Matakana Sustainable Development Plan. So Matakana is a small village up in northeast Auckland in what used to be the Rodney district. It's now a thriving village. But we looked around it and we said, what's some of the characteristics? Well, some of the characteristics was the rural vernacular in terms of architecture, for example, in terms of roof design. Some of the characteristics was to do with the materials of the place. Some of the characteristics were to do with, the nature of the streets, and certainly the characteristics of actually the village heart, if you like. We did design guides that had urban design based on some of those characteristics, and also landscape design in terms of what were some of the types of vegetation and those sorts of things. So it's unique to each place, and the master planning process needs to pick that up. Many things make up the character. So I just described one with the traditional quarter acre sections that we all know about, but one of the characteristics of that was that you have a front door that actually is visible from the front, you have a front yard, and that the front yard is a public interface with the street. When you have infill development and a house behind it, often what you get is a high fence put up. Suddenly that interface with the street, the public part, in the traditional we had a public interface and a private backyard. That was the character. So we need to find out, well, we know some of that character. Now it's like I said about your streets, they're quiet visually. How do we with growth make sure that you retain that quietness and that character you like? But I would encourage you, if there is a character that you think is really important and an essence of Martinborough, put it in your submission and say this is part of the character that you would like to see reflected in the master plan.
So we're not defining what that character is, and that would come through in the master plan consultation.
I understand that, but there must be some, I mean, in doing all of this work, you must have some basic ideas of what you're trying to retain. I mean, I look at, as a builder and a developer, I look at some of the things that have occurred in this town and listen to others and go, oh my God, why are we doing that? And to be fair, you are addressing a lot of those issues tonight. But if you, can we go back to the first slide? I don't want to take up too much time. No, the very first slide.
Dean, you actually want the problem is often it's
That's right.
after you've had your building, after you've had all that stuff, so we don't do that.
Yeah.
So how do you get it in front of that?
So if we just look at the second paragraph, so we're trying to retain a special, unique and complementary character and function. You must have some idea what you're talking about.
We have identified that there, and you've told us that there is character you want to retain. The identification of that will come in the master plan to say, okay, let's write this down now.
Can I
But you
just
just
say
said you've
that
identified something.
We've identified from you the comments, we want to keep the character.
What I'm asking you is to give some of that information out, because it's no use for me or anybody else here to say this is what's important to us.
Yeah.
And yes, you do want to hear that, but you've already said you've done a massive amount of public consultation. So you have a clear idea of what you want to do and where you want to go.
We can do that, but it won't be definitive.
I'm not asking for definitive, just got basic guidance. So when I put my submission in, I can say, you know, that I can look and say ME and say, well, you're saying these are the characteristics you want to keep. And then I can go, well, actually, how about this? Because it lines up with what you're saying.
You're horsely carding us a little bit. We don't want to preempt what the consultation might tell us.
Can I just add something through here? Character of place is very different from the three towns in terms of the structure of the towns. And one of the fundamental building blocks of character is the structure and subdivision of a place. So Martinborough is formed around a square. Greytown isn't. It's got a town centre, but there is a key main street. It's quite a different basic structure. And if we look at Featherston, there's the rail and the state highway. And again, it's quite a different physical structure. There are some similarities because you've all got, you know, traditional 4-8 sections and more of the urban parts of your township. But some of the basic structure here is very walkable, but these grid pattern of developments, what grid means, you know, it's kind of square going through. The pattern is very, very clear. Often when we look at a map, like a road map, for example, we can tell the age of a place by the roading and subdivision pattern. Because if I look at these subdivisions, and I've looked at quite a few now that are kind of going in, with the cul-de-sac, they're more recent. That was not the recent type of typology. So what we kind of, one of the things we looked at when we looked at this area here of the Oxford Alpha residential lifestyle, currently, you know, it's got a strong spike that connects in, that's part of the key character of Martinborough, because you've got these lines, you know, you've got this going this way and this way going down Jellicoe, etc. And this, that could replicate through the master planning process a similar type of structure to that, albeit at a different density. But I've also tried to look down character of streets myself and tried to answer some of those questions. And that's why I actually think some of the streets are more important than some of the other elements, because you've kind of got low rise, you've got a sense of space because there's not that much, the density isn't high density, so that's important. So height would be a critical component to be thinking about to me when you're looking at Martinborough. You might be only looking at 2 or 3 stories maximum in this area. You might only be looking at 2 stories here, for example. I'm not going to say those are the answers, but just based on, my walking around the place and being here at different times, and then I truly believe how you treat the streets. Because you can't always control what people do on their private property, only to an extent. But you've also got diversity in terms of house styles and colours and things. And you don't necessarily want to get that regulatory where you make everything kind of where it's too conformist. And that will be the balancing process. I hope that does answer a little bit. And when you see the other maps later on in the evening of Greytown and Featherstone, you'll see how their structure, the basic structure of their town is different. That helps to differentiate and characterise them, as does the infrastructure of Featherstone with the stations.
So I've just spoken with Russell, and there is some information in the constraints analysis with that, those characters, and we can get those to you. Yeah.
And thank you, Your Worship. Just quickly adding to Dean's point, and just a quick question. The character of this town is really closely linked to its economic well-being, and perhaps in New Zealand almost quite uniquely, in that we are this wine and tourism village. So surely there's got to be something that's almost the character of the town tied up to almost a vision for what the town would look like in 20 or 30 years, and not just individual submissions of what we each think the character would look like, if that makes sense. That's just adding to that.
Yeah.
And then the question is just around population growth. And this is actually, my concern is actually that if you answer this, well, I think you potentially answer this, it actually goes against what I've just said about the character of the town. Those population numbers are about 2 people per month. It just doesn't feel very high.
Well, it's not, but we don't know what's going to happen in 5 years' time and what the economy is doing, and whether you've seen quite a massive change very quickly. Whether that tap will get turned off, we do not know. But don't forget that this will be refreshed regularly. So this will now last us for 30 years. It'll be refreshed probably, we are predicting, every 5 years. So we'll go, what actually happened? Is this still relevant? Let's ask the public again. Well, what's changed in this world? Now, I just quickly mention the people in Zoom. We will come to you. So if you've got a question you want to ask, if you could. There is one there, but we've got a couple more that I'm going to go to, and then we'll come to Martin. Will come to your question. Yes.
First off, I'd like to say it's good to hear people talking about retaining character, because that's not what I read. I read respected character, which meant nothing to me. If I said I live close to Oxford Street, but not within that area, if I say what characterises that area to me, it's things like small holdings, sheep grazing within very short distance of the town centre. It's the ability to see beyond the front of the street and so on and so forth. Now, I've seen nothing so far that would indicate that those characteristics, which I think are really important to us, whether that you can't do that in any other town that I know of. How would you actually retain that?
So that's something, that information we want you to submit to and tell us that. And then we will take that into account probably within the master planning, or we'll make a statement on that.
The point is, we've already got a proposal, and the proposal says, I used to look at the bottom end, of course, that's what we get. If we break that area up into 2,000 metre sections, how can we retain it?
Yeah.
So I'd say the proposal doesn't match the character.
So
that's there.
And there is your submission. Okay, because we are asking you, we don't want to get into the debate here. It's more, do we need to give you more information? That's really good. Well, you need to submit saying it needs to be X.
My question follows on from the other one. They must have been things that you've talked about, because you talk about character being something that drives you, therefore you must have some ideas.
We listen to feedback saying we want to keep the character of the town. And that's certainly, we go, okay, here's the blanket, here's the character of the town. But in that master planning document, we'll be asking you what specifically do you want to keep, rather than guess what you think. There's another consultation required when we get down to that master planning. This is an umbrella document. This is a general, this is not a statutory document. It is just to give you an idea of the future direction. Don't forget, the district plan deals with those specific numbers and sizes. So it's a different document. I know that's frustrating, but yes.
Thank you. Just a couple of strictly questions. Has any work been done in terms of costing underground services? That is the question, if there are to be additional dwellings, the developer has to build. So in addition to the normal development levy, what is likely additional charge for underground services?
Capacity for infrastructure and can I cope with the
For
growth?
instance, if you're paying, I don't know, 15 grand per section development levy, is it likely that then there's a 75, 80, $90,000 additional charge for the component of underground services to access that new subdivision?
So this is the advantage of, if you're looking at ME and ND, which has existing infrastructure there, the additional cost per extra dwelling is so much less.
What is it though?
Well,
I can't tell you, but we can work it out. But again, it does boil down to how much growth you want and the pipe capacity. And so we know we've got so much capacity in our wastewater systems and our pipes. And so there's a step change that's required depending on the amount of growth that occurs. So we've got to actually work out how much growth and how much we can manage and in what direction. We're not putting pipes in multiple directions, so forth. So starting with this, we've got to work out and confirm where our growth is going to go and how we can concentrate it so that we can be very specific about where our infrastructure and our pipes go.
Okay, that juncture. That is, once the district plan is complete, even in draft form, rezoning, at that juncture, are you going to know what development levy will be imposed per section in each area? Because this, if you want additional houses.
So no, we would absolutely.
Okay, that's it.
Yeah, but remember the district plan's about 3 years out. Right. So I guess it's pretty, that's why that's why we're joining this up with the long-term plan. So we can do just that. You know, so we've got two problems. One is it's not just how do we cope with growth in terms of our current networks or the state of our present network. You know, so you know, honestly, we do not know in great detail, and we have to do it. It's just scary what our asset condition currently is. You know, so what our pipe network is, how the age of the pipes, when they need to be replaced. We can do modelling, and we've done modelling based on what we think the pipes are. We actually haven't done the asset condition testing, which is what we're planning to do. So we came to our long-term plan. That's exactly what we're going to do. So we're going to get much more detailed analysis about our pipes, how big they are in terms of capacity, the age, the condition, on real-time stuff. So it's not just models, you know, you have a cemented vessels may have 60 years life. Actually, they're probably about 40.
Okay, sorry, just one question therefore. In terms of the general urban design and aesthetics, and I use the my roots as an example of, you know, beautiful European villages, which are high density, high to medium, yet are beautifully aesthetically, that the dwelling merges with the streetscape. And my concern is that there seems to be a view that if that sort of development occurs specifically along the Oxford Street area and Regent Street, that the town loses that charm. Well, I disagree. I argue that medium to high density development, if landscape guidelines are imposed and if there are tight conditions, add to the depth.
yeah, and that's fine, and that's what your submission is, right? You know, because that may, you know, then we weigh these up.
Okay.
But your opinion may be quite different to someone else's. Often it is. Yeah. John, I'm going to get you, but I'm going to ask one of the Zoom meeting from Martin Smith. So the question is, in the current proposal, rather than seeking to make a decision now on what the proposed future 3 growth options should be favoured outside the recommended areas, could this A, be a future decision to keep those options open, or B, would there be consideration to selected expansion in all 3 areas, or has this already been considered? I'm going to pass it.
Well, I think the answer is yes.
Yeah.
I mean, the answer is yes. And please make sure you submit about that. Because I mean, we're proposing growth on the assumptions that we're making. There's a couple of things we haven't done yet. So one, we haven't looked at where industrial land is going to be allocated in the districts. Where right now we're looking at where the houses are going to be. And it's a really important thing, because that's the next step actually, is to look at there's basics, we're going to look where industrial stuff is going to go. And there's a couple of things that we know about that. One is we don't want to compete with like the Wanoa estate. We don't want big wet industry. So we're not trying to replicate Wairaka services and try and compete and create cement factories and all that kind of stuff. We know we just want to keep it light industrial manufacturing. But we need to make sure we're managing the reverse sensitivity to do with commercial activity. But right now, we're only talking about the residential options. We need to think about that. And for instance, that option that Ree was talking about, which is MF around Lake Ferry, that's already compromised quite heavily with light industrial activity down here. So it's one of the things, one of the factors that scored it down, because it is already compromised in terms of sensitivity.
But the joy of the submissions is that everyone said, MA's off the table, we want Wembley first, we consider that. Okay, this is not a definitive, this is what we're doing here. This is why we're going to consult. Now, John, and then we'll, yeah.
Well, thank you. First of all, I'd just like to congratulate the council and the mayor and the council officers. In my 25 years or more in Martinborough, this is the most transparent and well-informed consultation we've had. Thank you for that. If we just back up the truck a minute. And what I'm saying, you started off as your introduction was that there was a government directive to increase population, and we all had to have more people. Well, why? Just back up the truck and think, why are we doing this? And do we need to do this? And can't we just govern ourselves a little bit more? Because then I hear from Ree, sorry, and you want to protect the special character. Well, I just suggest, and I float to this meeting, that you're not going to protect the special character of this town if you have a whole lot of infill housing. Yeah. If you look at building a new development down at MF, if that's Lake Ferry or whatever. Ferry Road. Yeah. You're not going to do it. Yep. So just picking up on this submission from someone that's on Zoom.
Yep.
Why do we need to do this now? Why do we need to set things in concrete now? I know that's what local government wants to do, needs to do, but let's just have a breather and let's not commit to large scale development. Yep. By the same token, and I'll just finish that stream of consciousness, because at the moment we don't have the local infrastructure to cope with more development. We're still pumping our sewage into the river down there. When you go down the back and tell us, there's a big sign that says, do not take shellfish, don't swim, don't do this. Now, that's not your problem. You've inherited that. Yeah. But that's got to be fixed first. You don't have enough water. Now, I think there's the people I represent here, which are my neighbours and the winemakers and those sort of people, we feel very strongly about this. Martinborough does possibly need to grow, and there are certain areas that can accommodate growth. And I think someone was saying Oxford Street. That is just so logical because it's within walking distance of the town. It will probably give you 80 sections straight away. Yeah, I can go with, but any big, that's the submission that I will be making.
Let's weigh that up with other people's opinions.
Yes, I totally agree with that. Yeah, I just want to get it out.
But I at the moment have no opinion because we are listening to you guys, and that's an interesting point and a valid one. Right. If you want me to comment on the regional council, the government's impetus for growth, we'll have a chat afterwards.
I'd like to comment on it now because I would too. They can tell us what to do.
Yeah. Don't get us wrong. There's part of growth. Growth is a big umbrella term, but there's there's things that people have told us unequivocally. How do we have places for our workers who are working in our industries that's affordable, right? That's a form of growth. How do we make sure that our older people, as they want to resize down from a 4-bedroom house to a 1.2, so that's a form of growth. So growth isn't just more houses, and more green fields and that kind of stuff. It's actually managing the demographics that we have, so people that we can play. That's a challenge for all this. We want our young people. If you talk to, we went out to the Mariah around town, and their overwhelming aspiration was, how do we bring our Rangatania young people home to jobs, and how can they live here and work here, and that kind of stuff. So that's great.
Wonderful. Can I just make one more comment on that? And Ree, I think you said you're very focused on affordability. It is unrealistic to think that new sections in Martinborough are taught by working people. Forget that. Martinborough is a special town. It's like Waiheke, it's like that bird has flown. Do not create more sections on the basis.
So, John, submit a letter saying no more growth.
Right.
That's a valid opinion.
No, I'm not saying no more growth. I'm saying some growth.
Look, and I tell you what, the government in 5 years hasn't managed to fix the affordable housing problem. We're a small council. How are we going to do that? But we've got to be seen to be doing it.
made it worse.
And how we do.
Why do we need to be seen to praying to their song sheet? I don't agree with that.
And that is your opinion that you can submit on that.
Oh, thanks, thanks. I've looked through the A2 or A1 documents, both of them. I can reflect what the Secretary said. Congratulations to the council, yourself and council, on putting all that level of detail out. I went to the previous meeting, sat in the library for a couple of hours and read both the fact documents, one for each one. But what I couldn't see in them was what the thinking is from the council on how it manages this unique character, one of the unique, some unique or not, but a character that we have at the moment, that we double or triple our population at the weekends. And that we have the market fairs, we have wine festivals, we have all these people coming in. All we've tended to focus on in the plan there is houses and where people sit. But the actual infrastructure gets bombarded at the weekend. It gets bombarded with all the very good things, and that's excellent business and good. But that in itself is part of the character, not that we've developed. It's been wasted on it, if you like. People have come because they've got an attractive place to come to a while ago. Dancing me. But we've got so
I think you're right.
I don't see anything on either.
I think what you're doing is you're looking at an amalgam between the two plans. So a lot of that is being dealt with regards to infrastructure investment in the long-term plan. And then the spatial plan then has certain, is at the moment, we're just looking at residential from the spatial. So I think
I couldn't see how it was, I couldn't see in either one how they were tied together. Or how that weekend block, which is different if you're living in Shannon or you're living in Exeter, you're not going to get that block at the weekend.
So can I ask a question? How many people know the town of Matakana? It's not a dissimilar town in the sense of Martinborough, because it is based on, a wine and country experience, and it has an influx of Aucklanders in the weekend, so not a dissimilar situation to you. There's a few things I'd like to talk about that, and I actually took the mayor and the councillors through a photographic explanation of Matakana, because I was involved from very early days in a farming place for over 20 years. Where all it had was a general store and a petrol station and a couple of the traditional buildings in the old church building. And it was actually one major developer who bought a piece of block of land there, had high aspirations and a vision that turned the town around. So the gentleman down here talked about, vision. A master plan has its own vision. So there is a district vision here around, the best of country living with community at heart. When you do a master plan, the community, through the collaborative process, comes up with that vision itself. And yes, you should have a vision for Martinborough town not just the vision for the district. There's different levels of layers. Also, you talked about infrastructure, and I apologise because in a master plan, there should also be an implementation plan. And with district planning now, it's failed miserably in the past, quite frankly, because what we used to do is colour all these maps and say, this is where you can go. None of the infrastructure was planned. We've moved on from that now. You have to have an infrastructure development plan to go with a district plan, otherwise nothing happens. In terms of character and Matakana and what we were just talking about, so it was a sleepy little village, right? Hardly anyone went there. Redeveloped into a beautiful place, not dissimilar to Martinborough, although we've got much, longer history than Matakana. So what happens? Huge amount of traffic jams that go through Matakana because there's farmers markets, people are going up there just for the shopping experience and the wine experience. So what have they done? They've been innovative. There's been paddocks that have been by the school on the main road. They opened the paddocks up for car parking in the weekend. Now, I apologise, I haven't been involved in Matakana more recently. I don't know who owns the paddock, but the point is they've opened up one of the paddocks for car parking as a resolution for it. How do they maintain the quality of the amenity of the streets? Well, the businessmen who redeveloped the first part of the shops, the movie theatre, and also the farmers market, ensured that there was a targeted rate on the businesses for the purpose of maintaining a very high quality streetscape and garden component to the public street realm. And so these are other tools that need to be explored through the master planning. Now, I'm not saying that those are the right tools for Martinborough. I'm just saying that when a place changes and growth happens, it can actually happen well if there's a vision, there's the absolute drive to make sure you implement it and you take the tools. And there's also a balance to it as well. So what did happen in Matakana was in the end they said the commercial heart was the most important in terms of that character. The residential, they paid off a little bit more. It's still high amenity, but they didn't become so regulatory. What you do in Martinborough will be determined through the master planning process and the design guides. But it can be done. We don't have a lot of examples in New Zealand, but that's one that's not dissimilar in character and functionality to Martinborough.
Right. Sorry, if I'm the only other one, just conscious of the second question for me. So, Ree, that was a great point. I'm still a little bit confused as to when the master plan, if the master plan is wrapping up the character of the town or allows us to create, the vision for the town, and that vision and that character, we've all agreed tonight, is so linked to the economy of the town. So where's that part?
When does it get defined and put
Next, okay.
So it's an iteration. So,
Right.
so nothing becomes a statutory instrument in terms of rules until it's in the district plan. That's 3 years away. Literally 3 years away. And actually, unfortunately, it could be longer because the government's actually performing the RMA right now. All things going forward, we start this work, we're ahead of time. So one of the things the government is making mandatory right now is geospatial plan. It's trying to do that, but on a much bigger scale than district by district. So we're ahead of the game.
Yeah.
But the whole point is we're going to start this process now. Because the corollary, if you don't do this, it's developer-led death by 1,000 cases.
Yeah.
And so that's what we're trying to change. We're trying to change.
Yeah. Yes.
One thing at the very beginning, when we looked at the population growth estimates, etc., excluded from that were people with second homes or holiday homes.
Yeah.
Now that seems to be another unique aspect to Martinborough. Where does that come into the picture? Because we've got a lot of homes that are very empty Monday to Friday afternoon. But they boost the population, and that's fine because they bring their mates and they spend their money in our shops. And I've done exactly the same. Come and stay with me in the weekend, get dragged around the shops to improve the economy, and that's fine. But it's still population, and it's still motor vehicles that are parked on the sides of roads, especially around that square area there, which worries me in terms of high density in that area because car parking is suddenly going to become a major issue. Where does the factoring of those things come in? How do we estimate the growth of people deciding to have their holiday homes, second homes here based on Martinborough? Where's that factoring in?
Yeah, I'm going to, I have an opinion on that.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know whether the council has a statistic on how many holidays at home. I know that other places do, for example, only 50% of the homes there are holiday homes. So it is a key issue. We were just discussing it today, Russell, Karen and I, because, you know, it's also part of the Airbnb experience. We understand that Christchurch City Council is starting to look at how do you manage Airbnb. So it's probably a new matter that's emerging in light of, you know, the circumstances around it. I don't have the answers of that. I don't know if we know the proportion of holiday homes, do we?
In March,
We don't, but the 2018 census is somewhere between a quarter and a third of census night were unoccupied.
Right.
Now, some of that was unoccupied because they do live here, they're just not here on that night. And it's hard to get out those figures otherwise, but yes, a proportion of that will be people who have holiday homes and Airbnb and renting.
And it's challenging.
So there's multiple dimensions to that, so there's no easy answer. It's good, bad, and bad. So that, and the ugly side of that is that the rental, the market will be so strong that it precludes people to be able to rent. Yeah, so that's the downside of it. So that comes back to the affordable living kind of equation for people need to work in. And unfortunately, and we've had a really good look at places like Queenstown, Coromandel, Taupo, all those kind of areas that try to regulate or do something to try and deflate the B&B market to encourage rental. None of them. There's the ugly side to it. The other side, of course, is that all that means you've got flushing toilets, you've got, you know, you take a Coromandel that goes from 30,000 people to 180,000 people for 4 weeks a year. You know, so they have 8 plants, you know, and we're not that kind of level, but our population is like this. There's peaks in the year, often when our water is the least available. So on the infrastructure side of something, we're very, very preoccupied about, because it doesn't matter whether it's a permanent residence or a holiday home or it's the capacity. But the other side, our other counter pressure that's going on is the average household density. So the number of people living in houses is actually diminishing. So where it used to be, you know, your mum, dad, 2 kids, it's what are we down to, about 1.2?
2.4.
2.4. So the other countervailing pressure is that the people who do live here, the number of people living on a property is diminishing as well. So there's a bit of give and take in the market. So long story short, we actually have been very conscious that we're trying to balance it out from an infrastructure.
And we are carrying out a rating review next year, so that might be one of the tools in our toolbox that we can employ.
And as a council, we can act smarter to mitigate those. I remember last year, we had an issue with the Martinborough Fair coming up, and we were on water restrictions. And we went, oh shit, oh shit, oh shit.
Oh, no, we didn't say oh shit.
No, we didn't. And
You said something worse.
place with the Martinborough Fair with regards to water and water tanks and everything, and actually our water usage went down on a Martinborough Fair weekend, which was totally totally unintentional. But so you can manage those things.
It was people used water loops.
Yeah.
They weren't going to house and flushing toilets. So actually, it was a very good reason why.
Yeah. So we can mitigate those ridiculous peaks so that we don't have to increase our infrastructure costs to build to the end of the ground. Yeah. Do we have any other questions? Yes.
Just sort of, I think I was sort of picking up, I wasn't quite sure what the last minutes, but I remember when the council was looking at redeveloping this building, I looked at the census data there, and it was a really, really high proportion relative to the rest of the country of people living alone in houses here. So I don't know what it's like now, but have you ever heard of a council sort of giving incentives to people to take on orders in their houses, so to accommodate more people that way, rather than just necessarily building more houses?
And I think that might be something for submitting a district plan.
It's a conundrum that we face all the time. It's around, you know, regardless, there's always a degree of people that really struggle to survive in terms of social equity across the payments. You know, it's something that we organise us all the time. Every time we try and put the rates up, we're hugely conscious of what that needs to be. So long story short, we're really trying to think of all sorts of ways that we can assist people on very low incomes to actually continue to live. So any ideas gratefully received.
I was more thinking about bringing the workers in.
Yeah.
You know, if you're living alone in a house, and you're able to accommodate a couple in a spare bedroom, or you know, you don't necessarily have to build more houses. You can utilise, you know, the same as this building.
Yeah.
Didn't necessarily need library, could have utilised other things. Use the same logic.
Please, again, you know, council, we're not that smart. Otherwise, we would have thought about it already. So any submissions are a really good thing for us.
Yeah.
To try and think, well, hey, shit, we hadn't thought of that. Let's have a really good think about that. So please, that's actually a great idea.
Yeah.
Right. I think one of the other changes that I've seen in about 20 years is the walking as well. 20 years ago, if you saw your neighbours walking up the road, you pulled out off of a ride. It's very different now.
Yeah.
And so, you know, this whole look that we're talking about, which is great.
Yeah.
We've got to be a bit careful there. We need to encourage the walking. We can't put footpaths and then smacking gum trees beside it because it looks lovely. You know, walking is really a big thing in this town.
Yeah. And cycling.
It'll actually be one of the challenges as you go through 30 years. So a lot of towns, they come to town are pedestrianising, that they're not car priority. It's very tough when you live in a rural area to even talk about that kind of stuff. You know, Metacana, there's a whole places where you're parking out of town and you walk, you cycle, you use a e-bike or whatever it might be in town. You know, those are some things we actually going to have to talk about. They're so used to car priority.
Yeah, and that is where you're going to see that impact is actually in Wellington, Porirua and Lower Hutt, looking at the district transport priorities. It's all about cycling and walking and light rail. So that's, being rural, we're a bit isolated, and I think it's an issue we need to face globally. But it's crunch time at the moment in those bigger centres.
Alex?
You can't see it.
So I just one quick question. With MF, you're saying that it's already been downscored because of issues. Can you just go through the issues? Because it seems to be quite a good area of land.
Yeah, I've always thought that.
But if we have a better understanding of the issues, you're talking about 100-year floods, so as a builder, I'd go, well, we just build on tile. So what are the
So that information is in the supplementary documents on how we did our scoring, basically. That MF was originally not on this plan, and that came from a number of people saying, have you considered that? Because you actually got a paper road that's currently used as an ad hoc park, and you do actually have good connections coming through this area. But the issues were, I think.
Yeah, the three key ones were in terms of scoring, and remember this is high level scoring, was the board made a new connection is required and upscaling because of low water pressure in the area. So it's scored slightly lower than some others in that regard. In terms of the needing to upgrade the wastewater pump stage required here because of the lower flow and pressure, etc. And then the other was also around main flow through the town, so it's a 100-year flood protection zone. It's a regional council, a natural stream, and so some of the land would have been taken out. So those calls were assisted through Wellington Water. That doesn't mean to say that it's insurmountable, and it's scored the same as this. And you know, it was a high level score. The councillors did, as Alex just pointed out, indicate, you know, it's got very good connections, exactly the same distance in terms of the square to here. And the other reason was just a little bit more routes around Jellicoe Road in terms of, you know, the safety and those sorts of things. But they're not insurmountable. And that's what we've actually said, is that if you needed extra areas, there are some other areas contiguous, and you tell us what you think about these extra areas.
It's also close to the services, right? The water services.
And it is currently zoned special rural. There's a grape land area, and there are grapes that have come down to the bottom end of Fury Road. So there is a conflicting land use occurring: spray drift, noise, bird scarers, machinery. But I think if any of you, you know, the locals will know that that is one of the coldest parts of Martinborough when it comes to a heavy frost. And so therefore, a lot of that is not suitable for great land, and we were wondering if that's zoning correct. So there's a, hey, submit, if you say, this is my preferred option, I think that is not going to affect the character of town, it's still not, let us know. You know, on why you think that might be a better spot.
The only other point I'd make on that is we had high hopes for the area in terms of, right, let's get it in there, let's put it through the matrix assessment, because there's good connectivity, good fit with the school. It scored 5th equal out of the 6 options. It scored 5th equal with MB, which is what I'm calling here. Yeah, but we had high hopes for the area, but it does not mean to say that we won't reconsider.
Yeah, because we did wait our school. So there's still options there. This is not a done deal, like I said. So
it's obvious on this plan, sorry, I'll just creep up here in case other people want to hear what I'm saying. It's focused on the town centre and south. Did you give any consideration to what might happen at the northern end of the town?
All of this area over here is rural special one.
Yeah.
Right.
And because
so
that, there was a lot of submission and feedback around potential having, key worker and accommodation housing on that land.
Mm-hmm.
It's quite a complex issue, and so we actually put that option aside in terms of allowing it to be dealt with through the rural provisions of the district plan and the review that's going on at the moment. So we did look at it, but we put it aside for the purpose of this process.
and certainly at the moment, it's still special rural with regards to what was previously being designated prime rate growing land, and also integral to the character as well and the economy.
I just thought because you were saying that MF was designated rural,
Yeah.
then maybe some of those considerations should apply.
That one is total at the tail end, but I think someone was drawing a map, but I may be wrong. I wasn't thinking that. Yes.
Can I just, when you were talking about knowing how many people were permanent residents and how many were holiday houses, so did you have an idea of what that breakdown was?
Only a very, very rough estimate. There's no.
Are you sure the census data?
It's just-
I'm sure if you drill down into it, it gives you quite a lot of.
Short of doing a survey of people, actually.
Are you sure? You just gotta drill, you can drill down right to territorial authority and look at the Martinborough ward and look, and people answer, I mean,
There is population data on what's called usually resident population data, peak population data, because I do work with real papers, and it's quite an onerous process to go through that and then to try to, but you can do it. But for the purpose of this, we didn't go into that. What we did was acknowledge that a percentage of houses are being used for holiday homes. And this, Karen, your population data did have more of that?
No, it didn't. It was just looking at the occupancy rates. I haven't seen anything.
because it's changed in the
But
last.
what you can achieve by that, because at the moment, if
You know your town.
but you have, if someone purchases a property, they have an inalienable right of use. And if they want to use that as a holiday home, who are we as a council to say no?
I'm not saying you mandate,
So
it, but
therefore-
it's really, really helpful to know your town.
But the other way is to look at where the rating addresses are, and if they have a Wellington address, we can assume it's a second
That's, yeah.
Yeah.
We
And
can't make
again,
that assumption.
but we
It
still-
gives us a good idea, and we did do that assessment, but.
So down the back here, and then you.
So let's look at the rating addresses.
Oh, we'll go to things. Yeah, rating addresses, that helps us, but it's only a guidance.
Yeah, but it all tells people who got rated, which is everyone who actually owns property.
Yeah, it doesn't mean whether.
It doesn't tell you what they use the property for.
So
It's just simply.
Yeah.
They
For
own
the
property.
purposes of tonight, the spatial plan will carry on. At the back there.
Can I just get a clarification on the way that the residential zone is shown? Because it appears to include some green spaces, which the document rightly emphasises are important as residential. And I'm thinking in particular of Considine Park, the rugby grounds and Huangarua Park. Can I note that those green spaces are not intended to be zoned residential and allow development.
No, they're not. If that is the case, because the original green spaces on here were just meant to be identifying sites of a certain size over 1,200 square metres, and if all the development was taken up on how many potential houses might be able to be developed on the sites, how let's get a number. So if there are parks and things, no, they're not meant to be part of that.
And that's something we're very sensitive of, because there have been issues with regards to zoning of non-council owned reserve land in other towns that has really tripped other people up. So, yeah, we're very sensitive to making sure that they're protected with regards to zoning and designation.
So just a quick question, with MA, why is kind of the left-hand side of Oxford Street and Regent included in the town area, but the right-hand side isn't?
Yeah, good question.
So what you've got is a dog leg here. Why is this dog leg here?
Oh, look, that was just all we did here was take what the existing district plan boundary was. I mean, you know, boundary can be pretty arbitrary. In a sense, sometimes a road is a boundary, for example. So we just took that. As I said, the master planning might show that there is some existing development that you get some differentiation in that. But if you think that boundary should change, then tell us. Submit.
I think there already are submissions to that as well.
That's a very good point, because we've had that matter raised to us in written form, which now tests our thinking, which we have to take away.
Thank you. Right, if we're all done on questions then, and we haven't got anything on Zoom, thank you very much for attending.
What did you do with the audience?
Do you want us to go through Featherston and Greytown as well? Or are you happy
It's right.